So I first met Peter Blackstock in the early 90s in Seattle when he was a music columnist for, I believe it was the Seattle PI. Maybe it was the Time. We'll have to ask him that. Uh, he was also a music columnist for years at the Austin Statesman, where he covered many South by Southwest, but he's probably best known for co-founding, along with Grant Alden, the iconic Roots music magazine No Depression in the mid-90s, which was really, as much as anything or anyone else, helped usher in and perpetuate and popularize the musical genre we know today as alt country. I can confidently say, in terms of breadth, variety, genre, Peter has seen more live music than anybody I know. And that's saying a lot. I know a lot of people who've seen a lot of music, and I can confidently say Peter's seen more than anybody. So today we're going to talk music with a guy who has been eating, sleeping, and breathing music for 4 decades. Please welcome to this week's Fresh Face in Hell, Mr. Peter Blackstock. Pete, welcome to the show, buddy, and thanks for joining me.
Glad to be here. Thanks for asking.
Yeah, so when we first met in the early 90s, I guess you probably at a Ramadillo show, and we'll get back to Ramadillo, Pete Droge's band, because we need to talk about him, because Pete is out of his hermitage and recording and touring dates again. So it was probably at a Ramadillo show where we met. You were covering music. I was right? It was a PI.
Yes, that's
correct. You back then, you and kind of the late great Charlie Cross were kind of the men in terms of discovering and broadcasting new music in the Pacific Northwest. You're almost unique in that you covered a much wider range of music than we're used to talking about when we think of 90s Seattle. And when you were at a show, everybody knew it. There's always a little buzz for the musicians, almost like you were an A&R guy, because, print coverage was king. And if you had a gig, it was like, man, Peter Blackstock's here, we better play good tonight, because we could get some press. Maybe he's here to cover us. So talk to me about those days, how you ended up there.
Yeah, I never felt that way myself about, people caring whether I was at a show or not. Maybe that was the case, but that just it kind of freaks me out to hear it encapsulated or described in that way. For me, it was
definitely the case, my friend.
Just go.
And it makes sense if you're at a band and you're, coverage is king. You're trying to get noticed. You know what I mean? The best you can do is invite all your friends and tell them to tell friends. If you got a guy from a major newspaper there, you're going to know about it.
I guess maybe, if it made a difference and encouraged people in that way, that's great. But as far as how I got there to the gig at the Post-Intelligencer and Seattle in general, I moved to Seattle in 1991 from Austin, Texas, which is where I grew up. I wasn't born there, but went to elementary school, high school, college at the University of Texas, and graduated in 87. But I had started at the Austin American-Statesman when I was still in high school, in the sports department doing statistics. And I gradually, that was my senior year in high school, and I gradually sort of worked my way up the ladder in the sports department. And then I started going to see shows in Austin when I was at the University of Texas in the mid-'80s. And suddenly, just somewhere along the way, I realized, oh, wait a minute, this is a lot more fun than writing about sports. Mainly journalists interviewing athletes was sort of a lot of, dumb jock syndrome. And
they're not very forthcoming. I mean, they have handlers that train them to speak in cliches, because they always have to worry about causing, friction in the clubhouse. If somebody's we saw what happened when Jim Bouton wrote his tell-all about the Yankees.
Yeah. But, so I just realized as I started interviewing musicians and doing music stories that I enjoyed that a lot more than writing about sports. I still kind of remained a sports fan to some extent, but music had always been, since I was 10 years old and listened to the radio all the time when I was a kid, when all my friends were watching TV, I realized that I was kind of wired a little differently, and music was the thing that meant the most to me. So it was pretty easy to decide to start writing about it when I was in college. And since I was already at the Statesman, I already had an outlet even before I got before I finished school and got my degree, and did that for about 3 or 4 years in Austin, and really wanted to get the full-time job at the paper, but I was basically a freelance contributor, uh, and moved to Seattle, not really sure what I was gonna do, but, got on at the Post-Intelligencer, again, still as a freelancer, but it was more stable there. I also did some copy editing for them, and that was a good gig, and I probably should have just stayed doing what was relatively easy and good work, but instead, in 1995, I decided to try to start this crazy magazine with Grant Alden, covering alternative country. I was a big fan of Uncle Tupelo at the time, and growing up in Austin, I had been, frequently seen, artists like the Flatlanders and James McMurtry and obviously Willie Nelson, and there's just such a huge roots Americana community there.
Right, that was what I was gonna ask next, which
Yeah.
is, coming from Austin, which is steeped in more of a country and roots music, although you have told me in the past, and we might get to this, is that REM was very instrumental in your, lexicon, and that's why it's amazing that we're still friends because, I don't love REM. I know it's not popular. We'll talk about that maybe later, but, what was your impressions of the Seattle music scene having come from Austin, which has got this longer legacy for sure of music, you know what I mean? Like a
Yeah.
longer legacy as a music town. Seattle was just emerging as a music town. And you're there right as things are starting to happen in the early 90s. And Seattle's becoming, finally part of the bigger stage. And I know you're humble and you don't see yourself as a piece of this, but you were. So give me your impressions of Seattle having arrived there from and you just what was going on musically there compared to what you were used to.
Yeah, it was different, but they were both really, really active and had different vibes to them. But the change of pace was really good for me. It was just total coincidence. I moved up there uh, in the fall of '91, which was right when all of the big records came out and everything started to break. It was like I arrived in town just as the wave was
Yeah, it
crest.
was probably fortuitous timing in terms of you said you came here, you didn't know what you were gonna do. All of a sudden, they're looking around going, "Geez, we might need to hire somebody to cover music." So that's pretty serendipitous.
Yeah, I do think that the reason the Post-Intelligencer hired me to do a column is because they suddenly realized, "Hey, all this stuff is happening right under our hats, and we haven't been paying enough attention to it. We really ought to get somebody out in the clubs all the time." They had a staff guy, Gene Stout, who was very good at interviewing the touring musicians coming through and just covering the local scene in general, but they hired me to specifically be a guy out in the clubs,
And
and
you were younger than Gene, correct?
oh, yeah, yeah,
Too, so which is kind
couple
of
months younger maybe, yeah.
well, that's okay. Even a few years younger at that point, I think allows you a certain type of access to, your immediacy with the ages of the musicians and so forth.
Well, there was yeah, one thing about that, I remember specifically, I'd been there about a year, and I had gone to the new music seminar in New York City, uh, to cover, the Seattle bands that were playing there. Love Battery was there,
Yeah, shout out to Kevin Whitworth and Jim Tillman and the boys. Yeah, I love Love
uh,
Battery.
7 Year Bitch and some others, and it was a good year for Seattle, and of course, everybody this is summer of '92, everybody Seattle was on everybody's minds at that point, so the other bands still rising up out of Seattle got a lot of attention, so it was a good year to be there to cover that, but then, like, a week after we got back, one of the, women from 7 Year Bitch died of a drug overdose, and it was a really hard, sad day, but one thing I remember is because I had established relationships with people at their record label and other friends and stuff, suddenly the PI who was covering this as the news story that it was, they realized that they had value in me because I had these connections as a younger music fan who was going out to seeing bands going out to see all this music all the time. The paper appreciated that I brought them something that they were not getting from their usual staff hires.
Something interesting also is the music you started to cover. I don't know. Maybe that's because I was running into you more at these shows. Were kind of Seattle's own little alt country scene, which was sort of emergent at that time, which was very much not the same thing as what was going on with the bands that were getting signed with the Alice in Chains and the Soundgardens and the Mudhoneys and the and stuff we've talked a lot about on this show. But we're talking about bands like Ramadillo and Lazy Susan and Kitchen Radio. Did you gravitate to that because it's like home cooking or?
I absolutely did. It was a strange, just sort of perfectly fortuitous road that got me there. Pete and his Ramadillo bandmates about a year earlier had gone down to Austin just to see it because they were fans of all this Americana stuff, and they saw Austin as kind of a mecca for what they did. So they went down there just to have fun, and they met some people. They may have played a gig or two. I didn't meet them down there, but a good friend of mine, one of my best friends in Austin, had met them. And when I was about to go to Seattle, he says, "I know a couple of people up there. I know this singer-songwriter woman who is an old friend." And then I had met this. He says, "I'd met this guy in Austin a little while back, and they have a band called Strayland Street." And I was like, "Okay, well, I'll be on the lookout for that name." So my first night in town, my landlord suggests I should go see this group called Ramadillo down at the Vogue, and uh, I think maybe I didn't even know it was. I definitely had not made the connection that this was Pete Droge's band. This was the
Then
same
you covered it though, right?
Strayland Street. No, this was before. I mean, this is like my first night in town before I even had.
Oh, okay. Because I remember your description when you did cover them. That was like it was like country with a little more twitch than twang or something. I remember the exact turn of phrase.
Yeah, I did write about them about, within the next couple or 3 months later, uh, my friend in Austin who had suggested I go see Strayland Street, well, once when I walked into the bar that night, Ramadillo was on their last song. I missed most of the show, but Pete was wearing this shirt from Joe's Generic Bar, which was the bar in Austin that nobody went to. So it's like I'm like, there's something going on here. This guy obviously has some sort of an Austin connection. So I went up to him and talked to him afterwards. We realized that, oh, this is the guy my mutual friend was talking about. Mutual friend, his name is Rich Brotherton, ended up playing guitar with Robert Earl Keen for 25 years. So significant guy in his own right back in Austin. But he's the one who initially connected me to Pete, and then through Pete, I met everybody else in that sort of mini community in Seattle, which was the people you mentioned, the Lazy Susan guys, Kitchen Radio. There was a band called Bathtub Gin that was kind of that thing, and a couple other Pickets for sure, and so there was what I realized was that, yeah, even though part of the reason it was great to be in Seattle at that time was all of the grunge stuff that was getting so much attention, and sure, I covered some of that, and just indie rock in general, which was blowing up, in the early '90s, and I'd covered a lot of that in Austin. You mentioned REM, and so that's part of where I was coming at from Austin. Was I was really into alternative music, and then I was really into this great Americana scene in Austin. It wasn't called Americana at the time, but it was definitely sort of roots country rock. And so those were these two separate things that I had sort of fallen in love with in
So
Austin.
that's like Jason and the Scorchers, or like
Kind of, although they were a Nashville band, but they were those were separate. I mean, Jason and the Scorchers was kind of an early example of a band that was doing both of those things. But my incubation in Austin was I would go to these things separately, but it was never the same crowd of people. I had my friends that I would see at the Butch Handcart shows, and I had my friends that I would see at the Glass Eye and Reavers shows, So it was, and then when I moved to Seattle, it was a similar kind of thing, except the script was kind of flipped. The really big bands were the underground alternative rock bands who became mainstream, surprisingly enough. And then, but then there was this undercurrent of roots bands, and of course I gravitated towards those people. And at some point, it just kind of it just naturally got sort of combined in my own head, and then there were bands like Uncle Tupelo and the Jayhawks who were starting, and the Bottle Rockets who were starting to cross those streams. I remember asking. I was doing a phone interview at the PI with Matthew Sweet, and we were talking about different kinds of music that was coming out at the time, and how it was kind of this weird polarized time when the biggest acts in music were Nirvana and Garth Brooks. And he was laughing. He was saying, it might be kind of cool to combine Nirvana and Garth Brooks. And
God, I listen to
essentially-
Garth Brooks now, and it doesn't even sound bad anymore. I mean, I remember hating it then, and now compared to where modern country music has gone. I mean, Sturgill Simpson, and I think some artists you'll share with us later accepted. Just general, popular country music is not in a place I really like. But I think you can probably renew my faith in this. Your finger is so much more on the pulse of roots music than me. And it's interesting that because you're kind of a stag guy. When you talk about this, it's not like you talk about seeing different friends at different shows. When I think about you, it's just like Peter Blackstock's here and he kind of arrives alone. See, you don't see this. You don't see the mystique. I just remember it because besides getting, unless Charlie was going to cover you in the Rocket or somebody was going to cover you in the Rocket or or the early days of the Stranger or something like that. Music, this was a town that wasn't really used to having media that way. It didn't have a self-conscious sense of itself in a larger media, purview. You know what I mean? So it was kind of a big deal. I know you don't think so. And you can continue to be humble about that, but I'm telling you, I just remember when you were at shows, it was like that. There was a little like, wow, we got to be good tonight. I always ask people this about their jobs. Like we had Danny Bland on recently, and I talked to him about tour managing. And of course, I always like to hear great stories. And I know you have some, but I never know which ones you can tell, or you know what I mean, which ones you've told me in over beers and like Austin, and which ones are like good for the radio or whatever. But I always like to ask like how does their job work? And so like as a music journalist, this is another unique job. But I mean, so like with like how it works with book reviewers and things like that and book coverage, it's usually that stuff is assigned. But I kind of always got the impression that you get to freelance a little more. You get to choose what you were going to cover, or were you assigned? Look, we want you to cover this show, or like how did that work? I just want to know that like day in the life of a music journalist.
It was always a little bit of both, but I would say the majority, probably even the vast majority of the time, I was writing about stuff that I wanted to write about. Certainly that was the case in Seattle because, my role at the PI, and even my early days at the Statesman, I was never the staff music critic guy. And so when you're that guy, when you're the full-time staff guy, you have to cover pretty much, the big concerts coming through town.
Right, because the publicists are on you. Like
Yeah,
you're fighting off publicists constantly. People are fighting for that
It's not so much a
coverage.
matter of what the publicists want. It's just that's what your editors want. Your editors want stuff that is going to have big readership, and so they're going to want reviews of the arena shows and stuff. And I did some of the arena show reviews, but mostly
Awesome.
that was what the staff guy, Gene Stout, would do. And so I was most of the time I was finding stuff, underneath the really big mainstream stuff that I thought was worth letting readers of the PI or the Rocket know about. The Rocket was always much better about that because they were always looking for underground stuff. But at the PI, I was the guy they relied on to.
Right, it was more of an establishment,
Yeah. Yeah, and so most often I was getting to choose my subjects, the people that I would interview. I did a weekly column for the PI, and rarely was I ever assigned by my editor, you should write about this in your column. Once in a while, they might have said, "Oh, here's a good show that we don't have covered anywhere else. If you could put it in your column, that would be great." And usually I could do that, but I had a lot of freedom. That didn't really change for me until much later when I came back to Austin in 2014, because that was the first time that I finally took a job at a daily newspaper where I was the staff music critic. And so then I had to do more of the big stuff and get more stuff assigned to me. But I would say even then, the majority of the time I was still writing about stuff that I liked, and I could still write about stuff, digging underneath for things people didn't know about yet. That's something that I can I'll elaborate on more a little later with some of the artists that I discovered along the way doing that in that job.
Yeah, so like I mean, much like when we talked to Danny Bland, as I just mentioned, he occupies a place in the music scene that's not being in a band, but is very much a part of the scene. Charles Peterson, the photographer, again, another sort of adjacent, like he's capturing the scene, right? He's there, he's part of it. And here you're occupying this spot too, covering it in your way with words instead of photographs, but also you're a tastemaker, and so I guess when you're covering shows and acts, how much are you interacting with the artists, and how much variable is that? Is if it's a small show at a club, are you like just getting right in there, having a beer with the band afterwards and asking them questions? Compared to an arena show, or are you in the green room? Like, when you're gonna really kind of cover something, like how much interaction is there with the artist? Of course, what I'm getting to is some fucking tell-alls here. I want to get to like, eventually I want to find out who's a dick and stuff like that, so I know who to avoid.
Generally not that, especially if I'm actually reviewing a show, then there's almost no interaction
That makes sense. Like the food critic doesn't talk to the chef. Okay,
Yeah,
I
yeah,
got you.
it's definitely better not to. But, 90% of the shows that I would go to, I was not reviewing. I was experiencing the music, and maybe I had written about them beforehand. Maybe I'd done an interview before the show that was like, for a preview of the show in the paper. Or maybe it was a band, like a local up and coming band that I was interested in writing about, and I'd be writing about them down the road. But but if I wasn't necessarily reviewing the show, then I was maybe more, socially communicating with the band members and whoever. It's a lot of talking with people and getting to know each other at the clubs, but only some of that was, most of that was not necessarily the people on stage. It was the other people around, like the club owners and the bartenders and the other people who were also part of the music, ecosystem
Exactly,
that were.
exactly. I mean, that's how I view it, as an ecosystem. We just tend to think of it as this band came from there and this band and this band, but it really is. I mean, everybody had their favorite bartender that was part of it. I mean, I remember, even after I was in bands, I used to work at the Lo Priori Brothers Pasta Bar in the market. Dude, I fed everybody, man. I
Yeah.
fed the music and the Lo Priori Brothers. They know this now. I was good for their business, but like, I mean, Sean Smith and Reagan and those guys would come down in Stony and they'd all be sitting at the end and I'd be just feeding them. So like everybody had a place. It was totally an ecosystem. And it's, that's the difference between being kind of an aficionado, like the people that are like really into the Seattle scene and they read everything they can, all the oral histories and stuff like that. They get a lot of stuff about specific shows or bands or who is in the lineup that night and things like that, but they don't get Nina at the Frontier Room dragging dudes out by their hair. You know what I mean? That like all these other people in the ecosystem. And I thought that was really, I think, what makes a music scene. I mean, those other elements, it's not just about the music. It's just like, it's about the venues. It's about the mood at the venues. It's about the different personalities of the different venues and the different people that work at them. And like, I'm glad you used that word ecosystem to talk about, to talk about music, because I think it's a really underrated thing. I want stories from you too. But who is a dick? Tell me, we want who's dick. Well, I know another artist who you're not fond of, who this is our tell-all moment. But I don't know, who has also been not spoken of highly on this show before, who we all idolize musically. And I'm just talking around stuff here.
Yeah, well, I'm trying to think of. I didn't have, for the most part, I did not have that many really bad or negative experiences. The one that really certainly stands out, and it was stretched over a long term, many years, decades, is Ryan Adams, who we when No Depression started, in our very first issue, we wrote a feature story about Whiskeytown. Their first record had just come out, so we championed them way before anyone else. I mean, I think it's fair to say that No Depression magazine basically discovered Whiskeytown in an industry sense. No, the one before that, Faithless Street. Yeah, Faithless Street was their totally independent, small label thing, uh, and that got them the deal with major label Geffen Outpost that was Stranger's Almanac, came a couple years later. And when Stranger's Almanac came out, we put them on our cover, and I wrote the cover story. And so we had a really good relationship all that time. And what became clear about Ryan, though, over the years, was that he would do anything he could to ingratiate himself with someone who could help him. And once that was beyond the case of them being of any use to him anymore, he was like sayonara, and that was largely what happened with us. Basically, when he put out a record that he thought was going to be his big breakthrough record called Gold in 2001, we were not that impressed with it, and we said so. I wrote something in our editor's note, and then Charlie Cross did the review of the album. So, and I think he saw that as a betrayal, and he left really scathing messages on my, voicemail, and it was just, clearly at that point, and he threatened to do stuff like, "I'm going to get Universal to pull all of our ads from your magazine," and stuff like that. All of which was just, idle threat. His people at his label didn't care about his little, feud with me. But
It's interesting though, because I do see it from the artist's point. I'm not a user like that, but like with reviewers in particular, I had a guy who has reviewed me favorably at a major newspaper a number of times, glowingly reviewed. But then one time he just hatchet jobbed me. And God, I wanted to make a voodoo doll. I didn't go public with it or anything like that. But like I've forgiven. You have to have thick skin if you're going to be an artist putting your work out in the world. And what I realized is that I do admire an honest critic. If they give me a good read, you know what I mean?
yeah,
Like I always Paul Constant's been reviewing my books forever, I mean, in The Stranger, in the Seattle Review of Books, elsewhere, even the Times and stuff. And they're not always glowing. And sometimes, sometimes they're critical and sometimes they're not. But like I think it's important to maintain that sort of rapport where it's like, this isn't, you're not covering my friends here. You're not writing me a fluff piece. I expect a tough review from him. So like that's a hard line to draw, but you can always tell the little wussy,
it is. And the other thing is about it, it happened in some ways pretty abruptly because I think it was even earlier that same year, like maybe February or March of 2001, or not very far before, when Gold came out and this review ran, and we had this dust up. But yeah, I spent a long night hanging out with him in Nashville. He and Brad Rice, a really great guitar player from Raleigh, who was in Ryan's band for a while. And it was we were at 12th and Porter, and then we went somewhere else. We ended up at like 3 or 4 in the morning going over to the trailer where Gillian Welch and David Rawlings lived, and stayed up until dawn, basically, jamming with them in their back music room. At one point, we took a break, and David Rawlings says, "Come on out here and let's." We recorded Saturday Night Live. There's supposed to be a good musical guest or something. So we turn on Saturday Night Live. We happened to catch, actually, the night that it aired, the the More Cowbell skit. So I saw the More Cowbell thing with Gillian Welch and David Rawlings and Ryan Adams and Brad Rice, which is one of my favorite sort of like behind the scenes sort of late night hanging out with the artist stories. And then 6 months later, we're no longer, even, he hates my guts basically because I didn't like his record. So that's
that puts you in a pretty interesting position. Like if you want to be friendly with people,
yeah, it's a
people
good
expect
example of that.
stuff. People
Yeah,
expect stuff. Yeah, yeah. I've had that
yeah.
conversation with friends that are critics before. So I want to talk about No Depression because that's a seminal part of your which is a seminal part of alt country as a genre, period. As I said in the opening, I mean, you guys did so much to perpetuate and generate enthusiasm and popularize the genre. Take me back to the beginning. How did you know Grant Alden? How did you guys cook up the idea? Tell those who may not know. I mean, not everybody's aware. I mean, most people, anybody who's in alt country knows exactly what No Depression is. But like, I don't know, not everybody who listens to indie rock necessarily. And so, like, give us the No Depression story.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because this is 30 years since we started the magazine in the summer of uh, 1995. And Grant and I and a few other sort of people from that era gathered who did a panel last fall at the Americana Music Association festival in Nashville. And we talked about some of this. And it's funny how Grant and I have different memories of how it all uh, unfolded.
That's why I don't write memoir, my friend.
Yes. But, I mean, they do dovetail, but we both sort of have different origin stories in our heads. Uh, but I'd gotten to know him from working at the Rocket. He was the managing editor of the Rocket. And, when I came in to Seattle and happened to sort of, as I was saying, sort of catch the crest of the wave of the grunge thing, I made my contribution to covering the Seattle scene to some extent, but really, the person who covered the development of the grunge scene was more responsible for that than anybody was Grant Alden. He was the best journalist covering those bands. There were other writers, and he was their editor, and sometimes he was assigning the stories to writers like Jeff Gilbert or I forget who else was at the Rocket at that time, but Patrick Barber maybe. But Grant wrote a lot of it himself too. And then 1994, something or other happened, and he just decided he was fed up with the Rocket, and he left. Tried to start an art gallery with a friend, and that just did not work out at all. So in '95, he's at loose ends. He's got to do something. And he and I had developed a real respect for each other's journalistic sensibilities. And we were at a Bad Livers show. This is one thing we agree on. We were at a show by the Bad Livers, an Austin band who I'd known back in my Austin days. This was at the Tractor Tavern, and they were sort of this bluegrass / punk trio. Really great band, and
a great venue.
And Tractor Tavern had just started out, and it was
just great room sound there.
Yeah. So it was a good night there, and we had a few beers, and we had been talking a little bit about the idea of a magazine, and I had specifically thought this Roots magazine would be a good thing because I had been taking part pretty recently in an AOL message board that was called No Depression. It had started out as an Uncle Tupelo fan board, and then the people who were posting to it a lot realized they were talking about all these other bands that were kind of the same ilk, and they decided to rename the board No Depression Alt Country. And so then Grant and I start talking about this magazine, and I'm like, I think we both thought that there was room for a magazine devoted specifically to that, what we called alt country at the time. Really, it's a lot more commonly considered Americana now, and it's sort of a broader umbrella. But alt country was sort of a smaller set of that, and a good place to start with sort of narrower parameters. And I was like, okay, there's this online board called No Depression, so there's a little bit of a community developing there already. So I suggested that as the name. Grant was good with it, and he didn't have any other particular ideas. His biggest contribution early on to the identity of the magazine is he was the art director, and he was really, really good at that. And he'd worked a lot with, well, you mentioned Charles Peterson earlier. He did some of the photography from our early stuff, and it's the other guy that I'm thinking of that was more important. Photographer. Who's that?
Are you talking about photographer?
No, it's a design, Art Chantry.
Art Chantry.
Yeah. Great designer. In fact, the nameplate of No Depression was designed at Art's studio, and so there was this.
That's really interesting. So No Depression is really born more out of Seattle than it is out of your Texas roots. I mean, like
in terms of
the people involved in the convergence of the personalities and the artists.
Somewhat, yeah. Here's the real difference, and the big difference that I felt between Seattle, between Austin, and then when I moved to Seattle. There was probably more and certainly broader music scene in Austin because there's just so many genres that have a foothold there. There's a really classic blues scene with Fabulous Thunderbirds, Stevie Ray Vaughan, and that whole thing. There's the roots alt country stuff. There were the indie bands that sort of, lots of them in the 80s, and then the one that finally got big in the 90s was Spoon. But and there's a pretty good jazz scene there too. There were people who toured with Leonard Cohen, and it was a very broad music community. In Seattle, it felt much more concentrated on the rock side of things. There were definitely smaller pockets of other things too, but the bigger difference that I saw was that people in Seattle were not averse to working hard. In Austin, there was this whole, they call it the velvet rut syndrome, where it was just so comfortable. It was so cheap there at that time to live there. You could pretty much just get your your music gig playing in bars a few nights a month and probably make ends meet just on that. And a lot of people got so comfortable with just being an Austin musician and doing it full time that was okay with them. I moved to Seattle, and there were people who were really, really driven to become big names and had put in the work. And you saw and lived this firsthand with so many of your friends. And,
Yes, and it was actually kind of a philosophical rift too. I mean, there was sort of several schools. There was the group of people who were ambitious and aspirational and trying to make stuff happen, and the ones who are like, "No, man, this isn't why we're doing this. We're just having fun making music." People more aligned, like even I would say sub what you're talking about in Austin. They weren't even. It wasn't that they were. It was just raucous. You know what I mean? It wasn't like this is comfortable, we're making a living or anything like this. Is like this is just punk rock. So like, we saw, when we talk about Green River or, Mudhoney splitting off in Pearl Jam, we've talked about that in different ways and forms throughout this show. But yes, there was a group of people who were really ambitious. And I think that they taught a lot of people that, sometimes just a few people teach a lot of people a lot of stuff.
they did, but there was more than yes, there were people who, I mean, there were different levels of ambition there, but there were also, it was beyond just the people who were determined to become like big stars. And it was also just, I think of a band like the Young Fresh Fellows who were just, happy-go-lucky, having fun all the time. That's just sort of Scott McCoy's nature. He loves music and he does it in whatever way he wants, and he has fun. And they never became big stars, but they did have a pretty good career, as
Still playing too. Yeah.
And what I realized when I looked behind the scenes of that is it's because despite how much fun they seemed to be having on stage, and they certainly were, they also worked hard. I would go my first year in town. I interned for free at Pop Llama Records over at Conrad Uno's house because I just kind of wanted to see how that all worked and to see how they did those things. And then at the same time, you have Sub Pop becoming this juggernaut, and smaller labels like CZ Records also doing some pretty significant stuff. And all of these things were people who were willing to work. In Austin, I came across people who had, in the 80s in Austin, people who had big ideas but rarely actually followed through and got them done.
It's too hot. It's just too hot. I think that's a problem, man.
So,
You go outside in Austin, it's like, fuck, dude, I don't want to do this. Let's just go get a beer.
Yeah. There's lots of reasons. Some of it may be weather related, but just like people would say that grunge was a Seattle thing because of the rain, which I always thought was kind of overplayed. But what I did see. Even in simple things like Austin, the bars would close at 2, even on weekdays. And a lot of times people would be, stretching that well beyond 2:00. In Seattle, I noticed everything pretty much, ended, folded up at 1. The bars sometimes were open until 2, but the music generally stopped at 1. And what I came to realize, it was because, these people who were playing late night in the clubs were also getting up and doing work during the day. People were more serious about the music industry in Seattle than they were in Austin. And that was part of why No Depression happened. I came in with all of this knowledge and interest and energy from this creative, capital of music with Austin, went to Seattle, and there was also this huge creative thing going, but it was and an anchor behind it was all these people who were going to get the work done to make it happen. And then Grant was one of those people, and he kind of turned me into that person when we did No Depression.
Yeah, that's really interesting because that was not, I don't think that's a part of the Seattle music heritage stretching way, way, way back. I think that sort of like, what do we want to call this? That motivation, what's the word I'm looking for? Anyway, I think that was kind of a new thing. People starting to see, hey, we can just do it our way and we can build our own sort of infrastructure. Because unlike LA or San Francisco or even Vancouver, BC, there wasn't that infrastructure there. These people said, hey, let's build it. So like,
Yes.
you're getting there. This is starting to happen maybe 7-8 years before you got there. But like, it's still relatively new, it wasn't an old ethos. So this is a good time to kind of switch. And before we get off here too, I'm going to get, we're going to leave some time for, I want to get some recommendations from you. But let's talk about the music industry and how it's changed, the departure from the sort of traditional industry infrastructure to, say, streaming, which cuts out the cultural middleman, essentially, and all these jobs and all this. It just kind of hollowed out the music industry. And it was also sold to consumers as this democratizing force, you know what I mean? Kind of like the internet was when it was new. But of course, it hasn't ended up that way. It's kind of, gutted the music scene, because before streaming, you had all these channels for indie music, to use the word we were using earlier, ecosystem. You had distribution channels, you had tour venues, you had media outlets devoted just for those things. Streaming presents this idea of infinite scale, infinite growth, and suddenly you can hit everyone at once, and everybody could get a bite of that apple. So in theory, it was democratizing, but like, what happened?
Yeah, I don't know, too much. I mean, I've read a couple of books about that. I haven't read this newest one, Mood Machine, that's been getting a lot of attention. I'd read a review of that in The Guardian, so I kind of got the gist of what it's about and why the writer took issues with what issues they took with Spotify.
I think the other problem with the streaming, where yes, everything is available, but it becomes a problem of sorting out demand, right? Like,
Yeah.
we already figured out supply in the 20th century. We can ship all the records we want to all the stores we want. We figured out supply, but then once you have this horizontal, I guess you would call it, venue where, yeah, everybody's equal, it's democratic, but then how do you sort out demands? What do you see? How do you find new music?
I
Let me ask you that. How are you finding it?
that's a good question in terms of, am I finding it differently than I used to? A little bit, but it's still always gonna be skewed for me because I've got all this stuff being, emailed to me from publicists, and so I find out about music a lot because artists are trying to get me to listen to it, and so that is my experience, but it doesn't translate to how other people find it that much.
Right, so you're not, because a lot of people are probably just, like, beholden to the algorithm if they're gonna listen to, like, my daughter, she's like, "You have Blitzen Trapper?" And I'm like, "How do you know Blitzen Trapper?" "Yeah, I got about 2, 3 of their records." And she's just like, "Well, it came up in her algorithm or whatever," because she was listening to something and that came in. So she is discovering this music, but it's
Yeah, there's theoretically some value in that. It doesn't. That's not my experience at all. I do not play the algorithm game at all. Whenever I'm doing a playlist and something else comes on after it, I immediately click out of it. I don't give a shit what Spotify wants me to listen to or thinks I want to listen to. I don't discover music that way. I've got too many other ways to discover music with better tips than a Spotify algorithm, is the way I
yeah.
look at that.
Well, if you've ever heard one of my mixtapes, you know that I don't even wanna hear something that sounded like the last song. I pick the craziest mixtapes on vinyl, onto cassette tapes, and I mean, it goes from Ema Sumac to frickin', to the Afghan Wigs to just all over the place.
Sure. I use Spotify a little bit, but very rarely. I've never paid a penny to Spotify. I never will. Uh, but I just deal with the ads if I, to whatever extent I have to. But and I'm part of an old former music writer friend of mine created this. He calls it sort of uh, a book group for guys, but it's a music group. It's like, how a lot of women. I mean, it's not
Yeah,
just,
women have book groups, dudes have music
but
groups. I
a
know
lot,
that. My
a lot of,
my
yeah, yeah.
my late father-in-law was in one.
Yeah, so yeah, it's not just women, but there are a lot of women oriented book groups, and my friend was like, I'd like to have something like my my girlfriend's uh, uh, monthly book meetings, but with music and with a bunch of my guy friends. And so there's about 8 of us who every 2 or 3 weeks we take turns and we put up a playlist, and then we all listen to the playlist and we write about it. So I actually do discover a little bit from from being in a group of 7 or 8 people who are putting stuff out there. Uh, but still, most of what I discover is through stuff that gets, sent to me. And I will say I probably don't discover as much as I used to because I'm still following all the people that I've discovered all through the years. And at some point, it's just, you can't always it's harder to find places for new things because you're still not necessarily just listening to old music, and I love doing that too. I love listening to records from 30 or 40 years ago when I was a kid, but also, the latest releases from those people and keeping up with what they've done throughout their careers.
Yeah, no, yeah, right. I mean, you just like exponentially you
Yeah.
grow your cat. But
Yeah.
let's be honest. You hit your 50s, you start getting gray, and you start getting a little belly and some. I look like a lactating gorilla at this point. My nuts hang halfway to my knees. It gets a little harder to be on the cutting edge. You know what I mean?
Yes.
So
Yeah.
because I don't listen, I honestly I don't hang out with a bunch of 23-year-olds anymore. I wish I had that opportunity more. I'm sure I'd be rolling my eyes a lot because, I'm just the old man yelling at clouds at this point. But like that is the way in to find stuff that's going on that like you almost feel it's not that you're culturally not relevant. They're just you start to as you get older, you start to feel like there's things going on that maybe you don't know about.
Well, the other biggest thing is and always was the case for me, at least from college on, was is live music, and going out to seeing, in growing up in Austin and in Seattle, and I was in North Carolina for about a decade.
Chapel Hill, right, which is
Um,
another musical hotspot.
Right, yeah, so and, that was conscious. I moved to these places because they were music cities, and I became part of those music communities, uh, but the biggest way I became part of those music communities and the biggest way I got turned on to newer music is I would go out and see people, I'd go out 3 or 4 nights a week and get to know mostly the locals, so my discovering music a lot of time was really very specifically discovering the music that's happening in my local scene, and also occasionally I would find other things. You never know where it's going to come from. I became a
There's nothing greater than just it catching you by surprise. I remember I was on tour in Oxford, Mississippi once,
yeah.
and I noticed that I'd done a radio show in Jimbo from Squirrel Nut Zippers.
Yeah.
He was on the show too, and his band was playing later. It was just the Jimbo Mathis band, I think they were called. But the
Right.
opening, and they were great. But the opening band I had never heard of was this band called the Seratones. I would have never heard of them. I just happened to be
I
in
remember them.
Oxford,
Yeah.
Mississippi that night. And I went to the show, and now I own like, every record they make. I mean, like, but like, you're right. I mean, it's just because I was there at the right, it's when you have those fortuitous moments, man, it's just
This is
wonderful.
weird. I have a story. The story I was just about to tell also involves Jimbo Mathis. Uh, he's a North Carolina guy. When I was living in North Carolina, this is 2011. He was playing a show, some sort of collaborative show with some New Orleans musicians, and I was reviewing it for a local publication. And on the way home from that show, I had grabbed a CD off the stack, on the way out the door at my house, and it was a Townes Van Zandt tribute CD called "More Townes Van Zandt by the Great Unknown," and the Great Unknown meaning that it was like about 15 or 20 tracks, and you probably have not heard of maybe a couple of them you've heard of. Uh, so I just thought it'd be fun. I've always been a huge Townes Van Zandt fan and thought I'd like to hear. And I did know a couple of the artists. Kevin Russell from Shiny Ribs had a song on it. But then I'm almost all the way home. I'm about 2 or 3 minutes from home. This song comes on called "None But the Rain," which is not one of Townes's best known songs, but it was this Australian duo, and this woman had this just perfect, beautiful voice. I fell in love with it. I decided by the time I got home, I was like, "That's the best Townes Van Zandt cover I've ever heard. Who the hell is Leluc? Luc? Who is this band?" So I found out about them. They were Australians. They were living in New York. The following week, I flew up to New York to meet them. It sort of almost became like a surrogate manager for the next year and a half. And the end of the story was I got him signed to Sub Pop because Jonathan Poneman loved the record.
I
And
knew I recognized the
yeah,
name, and that's why,
so
because I cherry picked that. When I wrote liner notes for Sub Pop, I asked him to just pay me in records.
yeah,
And
yeah,
so,
yeah,
like,
yeah.
it was beautiful. I was better than any paycheck. I got, like, literally, like, 80 pounds of records.
Wonderful.
And
Yeah.
I think I put that Leluc on my list, but it wasn't available in vinyl at the time.
So that's
This
the discovery, sometimes it's just that much of a fluke. It's just something I pull off of a stack and a whole new world opens up. Yeah.
Yeah, this is why you got to push yourself to go out and see me. I mean, I think that's the other thing that
Yes.
happens as you get older is you go see bands you know. Oh, look who's coming to town, and you don't like. That's why I was going to Treefort every year for about 7 or 8 years, which is like a little mini South by Southwest in Boise, and I loved it because I was always discovering. Because I got kids, so I can't go out to music all the time. I can't even go see my friends' bands because I got to slog over on a ferry, and then I got to get home, put the kids to bed. But I would always make a point to that week. I had 1 week, and I would see like 40 bands, and I haven't gone in 2 years, and I've really missed it. So let's talk about some recent discoveries for you. I had you send me a list of a few people, so that just to keep you on track, because every time somebody's like, "What are you listening to?" in live interview, and I'm being interviewed, I'm like, I just go blank. So I thought I'd help you out. One name you mentioned was Leslie Mendelson.
Yeah. That's a kind of a good discovery story in a way too. And again, it's really live music is the thing there. Uh, in fall of 2021, one of my best gigs, one of my best responsibilities at the paper in Austin was I was primarily the guy on staff responsible for covering Austin City Limits events, which is mostly tapings at their studio. And so in fall of 2021, there was a Jackson Brown taping, and he's pretty much my all-time favorite singer-songwriter. And so I was thrilled to get to be able to see him in a relatively small room for this really great documentation of a set. And about halfway through, he brings out this woman, Leslie Mendelson, and he says, "We wrote a song together recently for a movie, and I wanted her to come out and sing it with me." I was intrigued. I didn't fall in love with that song in particular. It was good, but that put her on my radar. And then 6 months later, I'm out at Willie Nelson's ranch for a thing they do every year called the Luck Reunion, which they do during South by Southwest, but they basically draw a bunch of people away from Austin to go hang out at Willie's ranch, and it's much more fun than South by Southwest even is. So I get there at noon, and the first guy I see when I walk in the gate is the late Jeremy Tepper, who died last year. Wonderful music industry guy based in New York, and he's like, "Come with me. You got to go see this woman I know from New York. She's playing in the saloon right now." I walk in, it's Leslie Mendelson and a guitar player, and the first song they play is like the best song I've heard in years, and the guy with her too, I'm like, okay, he's a good journeyman guitarist. I don't really know his story. I look him up later, and this guy has won like Song of the Year Grammys. He co-wrote a song with John Batiste that won Song of the Year last year. I mean, he's a major sort of behind the scenes guy, and yet he's playing guitar with Leslie Mendelson because that's how highly he thinks of her talent. And then she goes in to make a record last year that has this song on it that just totally won me over. And, among the guys producing it is Peter Asher, who was like 1970s, like, uh, James Taylor, Carly Simon, sort of manager slash producer guy. He was in the 60s, he was a musician. He had a duo called Peter and Gordon, who were like a pop thing. And then in the 80s, he produced 10,000 Maniacs, were kind of my favorite band at the time in the late 80s. Them and REM really. And so even he's somebody like him, and he's much, he's well past retirement age at this point, but he comes out of the woodwork specifically to do this record with Leslie, I think. And all of the great LA session guys are on it, Leland Sklar and Ben Montench and all it's major guys, and still she's relatively unknown. I'm trying
Oh,
right.
not anymore, Peter. Now that she's just been name checked on a fresh face from hell. She's
Maybe.
she's going. She's gonna slowly explode now.
I hope you're right. And she's playing McCabe's in LA in the fall, and I'm trying to get them to add a house concert here in San Diego. So she's still at that club level, definitely. But just a great songwriter, great voice. The song that I love is called Rock and Roll on the Radio, and it's just
And the record's called Signs of Life.
the record is called Signs of Life. Very good. You've done your
Okay,
homework.
Jamie Harris.
Jamie
That
Harris.
was next on your list.
Yeah, yeah. So the two next ones on my list, I'm sort of going to combine them because they were, I was in Austin most recently for my latest run at the American Statesman there for 9 years from 2014 to 2022. And in addition to covering, Gary Clark Jr. and Spoon and Black Pumas and the big acts that were coming up out of Austin and the legacy guys like James McMurtry and whoever, the Flatlanders. I was always out there looking for stuff under the radar too. And my two biggest discoveries in Austin during the 9 years there were a woman named Jamie Harris and a guy named Pat Byrne. They didn't actually overlap.
Irishman.
Pat's from Ireland, yeah, and Jamie is, from Waco, Texas, and, when I moved to town, she was just starting to get known, and I wrote the first big piece about her when she finally made a full album, and then, for better or for worse, as soon as she gets that record out and she starts getting traction, she becomes involved in a relationship with, a pretty well-known Americana singer-songwriter named Mary Gauthier, who we actually had on the cover of No Depression at one point, moves to Nashville, and so now they tour as like a duo, and Jamie opens the shows, and then she accompanies Mary. So she has a pretty cool career going. It's still kind of under the radar, but that was the first time I thought, okay, this is what I think is a major talent who is coming up through the ranks in Austin, and those are the kind of things as a journalist you kind of live for, to find those diamonds in the rough and see if their career can, become what you hear in it. And so Jamie had that, and then she left for Nashville, and not long after she left for Nashville, Pat Byrne moves to Austin from Ireland. He had been the winner of the Irish version of The Voice, the TV, the reality TV show kind of thing. And, he had won it in, like, 2012 or something when he was, like, 19, 20 years old. And, but then they went through part of the deal, if you win it, is you get to put out a record on Universal. That experience was just horrible for him because they were trying to tell him what to do, and the whole thing with The Voice, is all really about singing other people's songs. I didn't mind doing covers, but he really wanted to be a songwriter, and so he just did not follow that dangling carrot, decided to travel around the United States, and eventually a good friend in Houston sorta helped get him set up in Austin. He moved there, started playing there, made a couple of recordings. I got to know him right after he had moved to town, and instantly was like, "This guy's a major talent," and he is still in Austin now, and he is continued to sort of have steps along the way as a career. But one thing I really like is that somewhere along the way, Pat went to Nashville to record an album about 3 years ago. I knew Jamie was there. I suggested that they write with each other. They wrote a song together that's on the record, and it's probably the best song on the record, and so I feel like, okay, I can still do something of value here. I see these two rising stars, and I connected them in a way that was beneficial for both of them.
You are a maven. See? I like it. That's the least humble I've ever heard you. I like that. You need more of that, buddy. You're the man. So let's end on as far as the Rex go, because then I got to talk to you about what you're up to as far as writing the column. One of these is a local San Diego discovery, because you're in San Diego now.
Yeah.
Briefly, that's different. I mean, it's you got some rock and roll. You got the Hot Snakes, you got Jim Croce, you got, it's got his Eddie Vedder. I mean, San Diego's got its own little musical pedigree, but talk to me about Lonesome Roses.
Yeah, I will, yeah. Yeah, and there's some Seattle and, San Diego back and forth. Eddie Vedder's the most obvious of those, but there's a guy named Andrew McCaig who was in a band down here called Uncle Joe's Big Old Driver that moved to Seattle in the 90s, and Andrew became sort of a musician who worked with lots of people up there. And then the other guy is Gary Heffern, who was a punk guy down here, and he moved to Seattle and became more of a singer-songwriter, and one I got to know really well. So there's always been some back and forth there between those two cities. San Diego has its own distinct music community that I only feel still a little bit on the outskirts of. I have a lot to learn about the local music scene here, but I got hip to one of the best young local acts there oddly enough, by my former No Depression co-editor, Grant Alden, who lives in Kentucky now, hardly pays attention to music at all. The only thing he does at any time during the year that is related to music and Americana specifically is he goes down to Nashville for the Americana Music Awards, and he writes the script for the Americana Music Awards show. The people who he knew when he lived in Nashville just always loved him so much and think he's so good at it that they've brought him back to do that for like 15 years in a row. And so he's telling me about this woman he met at the Americana Music Awards show. She was like a production assistant, but was also singing background with a couple of the acts. Her name was Molly. I forget the last name at the moment, but
Is this the one that used to go by the name?
yes, they
That's a good handle.
the
What's her
reason
name?
I found out about him was Grant and I now write we alternate. It's a good way to bring this up. We do a monthly column for the No Depression website.
That was where we were going to end this interview because to preface this, I will say that you and Grant sold No Depression a number of years back, but this listeners is where you find Peter Blackstock now, which is tell us about the column you guys are writing.
Yeah, so a couple of years ago, basically when I left the Statesman and I moved to San Diego, I was like, I'd like to do something, have a regular presence somewhere with a foot in the door. And I had a pretty good relationship with a couple of the editors who do the No Depression website now. And I said, how about if I do this column called Founders Keepers?
Very clever.
And let me see if I can, initially it was going to be founder apostrophe S Keepers, and I would do this column. And then I thought, what I really want to do is get Grant back into writing more. And so maybe we could alternate it. And so we'll make it S apostrophe. And so now we alternate columns. And as a result of that, one of Grant's first columns, he had met this woman, Molly, in Nashville, and she had given him their 5-song EP. And the band at the time was called Shh, SHHHH. He wrote about them in his column. And I'm like, damn it, Grant's scooping me on San Diego artists.
Stay in Kentucky. You got plenty of music in Kentucky.
But it was great because he did make me aware of them. And then I went out to see them locally and immediately realized, there's really talented. And about sometime earlier this year, I think they finally realized that the name was getting to be a little bit of a problem. So they changed it to Lonesome Roses. And they still have only released a few songs, but real serious talent there. The woman named Rihanna and a woman named Molly Jensen. That's it. And Rihanna Downey. And they're just really good singers, really good songwriters. They're an odd fit, I think, in some ways for San Diego because that country folk stuff maybe has a harder time finding a foothold here. I think really it's largely there's not a great venue for it. There's a lot of various kinds of venues here and some pretty good ones, but no sort of small incubating coffee house kind of thing to really encourage a songwriter community. So
you hear that, San Diego listeners?
So they're
listening to me. Somebody needs to make that happen.
I've been thinking of ways I could try to, and I don't think I really have the means to. But if
you're listening out there and you're in San Diego and you want to capitalize Peter, I think we found the guy to run the venue. He is Peter Blackstock. He is a fount of musical knowledge. It's been so wonderful catching up with you, buddy. I look forward to my next trip to San Diego so we can go out and drink beer. Find his column at No Depression along with Grant Alden. They alternate. It is called Founders Keepers, of course, because they were the founders of No Depression. Now they are the elder statesmen. Thanks so much for joining us, buddy. I really appreciate it. It's been great catching up with you.
Oh, man, this is great. Yeah, I really enjoyed it.